So today we'd like to welcome Professor Eric Lohr. Professor Lohr is chair of the History Department at American University, and author of several books, including Russian Citizenship, From Empire to Soviet Union. He received his MA in Russian Studies and Ph.D. in History from Harvard. He has been active in discussion of U.S. and Russian relations, including service on the Russian-Europe Advisory Committee for the Hillary Clinton campaign for president in 2007 and 2008. We welcome Eric back to Central Wisconsin as he discusses Russia, 1917 to 2017, Reflections on a Turbulent Century. Welcome, Professor Lohr.
Oh, sure, thanks. Great, well, it's great to be back in Wausau, and it's great to have standing room only for a talk on Russia. I'll be sure to tell my kids this because they think of Russia as that loser country that my loser dad spends so much time on. This is proof positive that there's something to talk about. I know that you all know the importance of the Russian Revolution, unlike my students, all of whom now were born after communism, and I have to explain to them why it was important. But I'm going to do that anyway today a little bit. But since a picture is equal to 1,000 words, and 1,000 pictures in a row in a short film clip, by analogy, would be worth about 1,000,000 words, why don't we just have a short film clip about what the Russian Revolution was all about, almost exactly 100 years ago. The October Revolution, which was really in November, but that's irrelevant right now, about 100 years ago. So here we go. This will be a classic clip from Sergei Eisenstein, arguably the greatest and most influential film producer in the early 20th century, and music by Sergei Prokofiev, who I see will be in part of the music appreciation series that you have coming up. This is the finale, the end of a hour and 40-minute feature film, that Sergei Eisenstein created on the 10th anniversary of 1917 Revolution of October 1917. So one of the things that Eisenstein was famous for was not having actual character actors as the center of his films. What he had was classes, acting as classes, and these are real people. They're not actors. These are people he took from factories and from the soldiery, and they acted out these scenes in very dramatic fashion. Okay, I think we get the picture. That's enough, thanks. So you can see what the revolution was all about. It was the masses gathering and in violent fashion storming the Bastille. That was kind of the image from the French Revolution, and that set the pattern for what revolutions should be all about. Now, let me read you an alternative view of the events of this time by a famous historian who I worked with at Harvard by the name of Richard Pipes. At 9 a.m. on October 24, Kerensky was the liberal leader of the government that had been formed in a revolution in February 1917, a few months before the October takeover. Kerensky at last contacted frontline commanders and asked for aid. None was available. At 9 a.m. on October 25, he slipped out of the Winter Palace, disguised as a Serbian officer, and in a car borrowed from a U.S. embassy official flying the American flag, he drove off to the front for help. By then, the Winter Palace was the only structure still left in government hands. Lenin insisted that before the Second Congress of Soviets actually opened and proclaimed the new provisional government deposed, the ministers had to be under arrest, but the Bolshevik forces proved inadequate to the task. It turned out that for all their claims, they had no men willing to brave fire. Their alleged 45,000 Red Guards and tens of thousands of supporters among the garrison were nowhere to be seen. A half-hearted assault on the palace was launched at dawn, but at the first sound of shots, the attackers beat a retreat. After months of organizational work in the factories and garrisons, the Bolsheviks turned out to have no forces willing to die for their cause. As night fell, the defenders of the palace, dispirited from the lack of promised support, began to withdraw. The Cossacks left, and only the Women's Death Battalion and teenage military school trainees remained. When gunfire from the palace ceased, Red Guards and sailors cautiously drew near. The first to penetrate were sailors and troops of the Pavlovsky regiment who clambered through open windows on the Hermitage side. Others made their way through unlocked gates. The Winter Palace was not taken by assault, but simply taken after it ceased defending itself. The total casualties were 5 killed and several wounded. Now, in the history of film, there's an interesting aspect. When I read a book about the making of Eisenstein's film, apparently they had regular soldiers involved in the screening, and there were a couple mistakes where they were supposed to be issued blanks, and they actually had live ammunition. And apparently, more than 5 people died in the screening of the of the commemorative film. Of 1970. So, I mean, this is just one way, maybe a dramatic, overly dramatic way of pointing out that October 1917 has many different meanings to many different people. And in fact, there's a book by a colleague of mine who argues very much that, in kind of a postmodern fashion, that the only meaning that the October 1917 actually had was accrued afterwards by the meanings that people gave to it. Here's another prominent historian who wrote what I think is the best book on 1917. Right now, my assignment is to review 15 books on 1917 for the Journal of Modern History, and I agreed, and then I got them in the mail, and they're all 1,000 pages. So, so I have homework. So don't complain about your homework if you have some here. But he wrote, I think, was one of the best books in this stack. And he said the February Revolution was shot through with revolutionary spirit. In contrast, the October Revolution took place amidst apathy. On the day the provisional government was overthrown, the stores and restaurants were open, the trams ran, the cinemas were crowded. The momentous event that shook the world was almost unnoticed by contemporaries. If you look at the New York Times account of the event in October, there's a little notice on page 8 that says, extreme anti-war group claims power in Petrograd, unlikely to hold it more than a week. So you don't really know what's happening until after it happens sometimes. So what was the October Revolution? I've given now 15 talks this year on the centenary of the Russian Revolution all over the place and published a few articles on it. I have my own point of view, and I've been arguing that what it was really a state collapse and a total vacuum of authority that began with the February Revolution months before. And without understanding that total collapse and lack of power, you can't understand what happened in October. But that raises another question. So what was the most important revolution in 1917, and what are we looking back on? I have a little quip that I say the most important revolution in 1917 was the 1905 revolution. And that's because in 1905 there was a liberal revolution against the Tsar, who at that point had totally unlimited authority. And it was a classic revolution akin to the revolutions of 1848, 1789, that created for the first time in Russian history a parliament with national elections, rule of law. A lot of the things that we have in the Bill of Rights were implemented into a new constitution. In February 1917, there was a revolution very much along those lines that deepened and went back to a lot of those principles that the Tsar had kind of pushed back on in the intervening years. And I'll make the case eventually that the February Revolution was the truly important revolution in 1917. But let me make the case for October. I mean, October was what led to communism and the triumph of communism in Russia. And of course, I don't need to really make the case here, but it led to global communism. Because the Russian Revolution was the first, Russia was the first major country to have a communist revolution, what they called communism became communism, even though Marx might not recognize it as such. And that model was an extremely brutal one. It was a model that Stalin developed based on the principle of economic development based on domestic resources only, based on a complete break with the international economic system, gathering resources through brute force from the agrarian population through a process called collectivization, where peasants were forced onto collective farms. And the surplus that they created was expropriated and directed towards forced industrialization. And there was a very strong focus on military spending and mobilization. And that model became a model that was copied, of course, in many different parts of the world with brutal consequences. The Black Book of Communism claims 100 million victims, which is probably too high, but it's in the tens of millions globally, for sure. Since 1991, there's been a lot more access to the archives, and economic historians have recalculated the rates of growth that all this led to. And what looked in the 1960s very impressive in terms of Soviet achievements of industrialization, economic historians have sort of recalculated to the point where the growth rates, even in the 1930s for the Soviet Union, don't look all that impressive at all, and the costs were much greater than we thought. So there's obviously huge number of negative impacts, reasons why the October Revolution was the most important revolution in 1917, but there were some positive impacts too that that should be noted. One is, if you raise the question, would there have been would Britain and France, for example, still have global empires? And the answer might be perhaps yes. Of course, communism became many things, and one of the things it became was an anti-colonial movement, and that was one of its most powerful appeals in the 20th century, and it clearly, with support from the Soviet Union, was one of the big factors in decolonization. And another thing that I've been thinking about since the fall, I just went and checked some figures because I thought, I've kind of always thought that the communist threat, having communism as an other, was really important in keeping our society from becoming too unequal and keeping investment in education and science in particular. Can you imagine the moonshot under JFK without the communist threat and communist competition? All of these things, I think, are fairly important. Could we have those charts, please? So I looked up some charts, and if you could just go through the charts. These are various ways of measuring inequality in the United States, and the percent of income in the top 1% and in the top 0.1%. And if you look at where the peaks are, they're basically right after the revolution. There's a peak in the 1920s, and then it goes down, 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 down. And in 1991, right around 1991, when communism ends, American inequality starts to go through the roof in a continuous pattern. I just can't imagine that, for example, the tax bill just recently passed. I imagine there would have been some opposition from Cold Warriors who would have said, we're fighting an ideological battle against the Soviet Union. We can't be this unequal, otherwise we're going to look bad in this competition. So there's that impact. There are tons of other impacts, but that's throw a little politics in there. Why not? All right. So I said I would make the case for 1905 being the most important revolution in 1917, and that's what I'd like to do now. Because, for all the problems of the past decade, democracy is still the form of government in most of the world. And it's under threat, but there's reason to think that it ultimately will prevail. And one thing I'd just like to, because it's very easy, I think, when you read newspapers about Russia and see stories about Russia, to become extremely negative about Russia and pessimistic that, it's backslid, it's under Putin, it's become an autocracy again. That word is often used. But I think it's important to keep things in perspective. Democracy was never established anywhere instantly overnight. How long did it take the United States to expand the franchise to African Americans? How long did it take America to expand the vote to women? How long? It took hundreds of years. It's a project that should be looked at as a project over hundreds of years. Look at Germany, arguably one of the greatest democracies on the planet today. Was its path to perfect democracy smooth? Not so much. Every place, you can look at almost any country, and typically people say, oh, well, Russia's not like the West. Well, what is the West? Nazi Germany? Is it Franco's Spain? What is it? Democratization's a long road, and in that sense, if you look at the long scope of things, really, Russia's had a really remarkable run over the last 150 years. In 1861, Russia emancipated its serfs before the U.S. emancipated the slaves. and passed a series of great reforms. The autocracy came under limits, many substantial limits, and the great majority of the population became citizens after 1861. In 1905, there was the Great Revolution that I already mentioned that introduced a parliament, rule of law, constraints on the power of the Tsar, of the king. In 1906, there were a series of reforms that created private property in the countryside that were very important. And in February 1917, in the midst of World War I, there was the furthest extension of Russian liberalism, the end of all restrictions based on nationality, equality of all religions and all social groups under the law. A remarkably liberal set of reforms, but unfortunately, the government decided to keep fighting World War I, very much under pressure from the new entrant into the First World War. The United States put huge diplomatic pressure on Russia to keep fighting the war and to launch an ill-fated offensive that really led things to fall apart. So this experiment in democracy really floundered under the pressures of the populace that was just sick and tired of fighting this war. If you look in this long span of the development of democracy in Russia, I would put it as the Bolshevik era was a relatively brief 70-year hiatus, and things picked up again in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reintroduction of democratic electoral politics, rule of law, and the like. That then came under, now for the last 17 years under Putin, it has been rolling back. But a lot of things still are in progress. And what I'd like to do in sort of the last part of the talk is to go through a series of different aspects of the Russian Revolution, the communist revolution, and ask what was revolutionary and what was not revolutionary or reactionary about the October Revolution or the Communist Revolution. And then at the same time kind of assess, well, how does that relate to the last few years and see, develop a kind of scorecard for all these different aspects of the revolution. So what was revolutionary about the October Revolution? Well, first and most obvious, actually, was the destruction of the Orthodox Church. This was the most important institution in 1,000 years of Russian cultural and religious history. In 1917, that church was undergoing a revolution of its own. There was a great council of all the leaders of the church that gathered in the summer of 1917, and they were talking about some amazing, deep-rooted reforms. And the proceedings of that set of sessions of the Great Council have all been published recently, and people are talking about them. So what happened in the last, since 1991, has been a truly remarkable thing. A church that was totally and utterly destroyed by the Soviet Union has come back into existence. Churches have been rebuilt. But unfortunately, the ideals of 1917 have been decisively rejected, at least for now. And the church has been hand in glove with Vladimir Putin in the project of rolling back all forms of liberalism. So it's gone in a very negative direction, but the story's not over. There are conferences on the reformist elements in the church in 1917, publications, and there are priests in Russia, scattered throughout Russia, who are still talking about those kind of ideas. So that story goes on. The second thing that was clearly revolutionary about the October Revolution was something that I call class-based affirmative action and disaffirmative action. That was that the revolution went really out of its ways, the Soviet state went out of its way to give workers and peasants paths of upward mobility through education primarily, but also in hiring practices. And this was very serious, and it was taken seriously all the way through the Soviet era. How has that what's happened on that score since 1991 has been kind of sad. It's the Soviet Union used to be really good at figuring out where the talent was, where the next great physicist maybe in the middle of Siberia was, the next great hockey player or ballerina, and getting them into the elite institutions, educational institutions and training institutions. Now it's more about money and connections for all of these things, and that whole system has fallen apart. So that's one revolutionary thing that has not come back. Another revolutionary thing about the revolution was the unique Soviet approach to nationality. The Soviet Union was a very diverse place with lots of different nationalities, and the Soviet Union was the only major empire that figured out how to decentralize cultural aspects of the nationality question on a large scale, whereby each titular nationality had control of their own Ministry of Education and their own policies of language taught in schools, used in public, and in all kinds of things. And it worked. The Soviet Union was the last standing major empire. The Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the French, British, all collapsed before the Soviet Union did. It was the longest lasting empire. And that's a big reason why, because they kind of diffused at least the cultural side of the nationality question. How have things gone since 1991? Well, the biggest aspect of 1991 is the entire empire finally did fall apart, and there are now 15 independent states. So that, in some sense, solved the nationality problem, but not entirely. There's still about 15% of the Russian population is Muslim, and there are many minorities. And Russia really has not done a great job since 1991 on that. There's been a xenophobic wave, populist wave that predated our own. Anti-immigrant sort of sentiments very strong in Russia. So that was a revolutionary aspect that has kind of been rolled back. One of the biggest and clearest revolutionary aspects, arguably, was the Soviet Union's approach to women. Women were given the vote. The Soviet Union became the first country in world history to legalize abortion and divorce. All kinds of professions were opened up in theory for women. In practice, very quickly, a very conservative patriarchal society's norms established themselves, and there were glass ceilings. Women couldn't get promoted above a certain level. If you see pictures of the Congress of Soviets, which is the 1,500 most powerful communist officials through any period in the Soviet era, there's not a single woman in the picture. So there were clearly glass ceilings, but there were also clearly innovative and revolutionary changes. The extension of the vote to women happened before it did in other countries. I mean, when there's only one party to vote for, that does kind of put a damper on things, but still, you know. The other revolutionary thing I think that is really usually left out of lists like this that I have written a lot about is the autarkic model of modernization that the Soviet Union embraced. It industrialized a fairly backward country based almost entirely on its own domestic resources at great cost. And that became the model for communist development that was followed throughout the rest of the world. What's happened since 1991 has been very interesting. Initially in the 1990s, the Soviet Union really embraced opening up its borders to international trade, and there was a long and hard push to gain membership in the World Trade Organization, which was achieved under Vladimir Putin in the 2000s. And there was great hope that this would really help in a lot of ways. There's been a big pushback against all these kind of aspects, and it's been driven by the fact that Russia's economy is very reliant on gas and oil exports. And unlike the United States, almost every country that has large gas and oil reserves nationalizes and controls the revenues from those resources. And Russia, after an initial wave of very unfair privatizations, decided to nationalize all these industries. And it's really, I think, undermined this whole integration into the global economic system. So that's very much, I think it's a key barometer to watch as to where Russia is headed in the future, is how its integration in the global economy proceeds and whether nationalization of gas and oil extends to more and more and more other industries. And that still is an open question. what was reactionary about the October Revolution? Well, the most reactionary thing was the reversal of the agrarian revolution. The agrarian revolution is kind of a complicated thing, but what it was in Russia, there was a peculiar form of land ownership known as the peasant commune, where all land was communally tilled and the products of agriculture were shared and marketed jointly by village communes. In 1906, as the series of reforms in the liberal era of the revolution, there was an attempt to privatize land in the countryside, and it was making substantial progress. In 1917, a big part of the October Revolution was really not something that the Bolsheviks wanted. It was a spontaneous seizure of all of the private land in the country by the peasantry, and the absorption of all of that land, whether it belonged to landlords, the church, the state, or other private individual peasant farmers. All of that land was absorbed back into peasant communes. But that's not what the Bolsheviks wanted in the long run. They wanted nationalized land. So they launched a collectivization drive, which drove peasants off of their communes into state-run farms that basically paid wages to farmers. And it was their way of making sure that they could expropriate as much as they could from the countryside to drive industrialization. About 5 million peasants died in the process because there was great widespread resistance. It's one of the great crimes of the century, and in fact, it's been recently voted in several countries as a genocide directed against the Ukrainian people, but the victims were not just Ukrainians. It was just as brutal in Russian areas as well. So that, in a way, is, I think, the best sort of general way to think of it is the restoration of serfdom, restoration of the system of pre-1861 coercive state-owned peasantry throughout the country. Clearly a reactionary thing. Democracy obviously was totally abolished. The system of governance that Lenin created was very much an autocracy led by him at first and then by Stalin later. There's been much talk about Vladimir Putin as restoring the principle of autocracy. And he's clearly moved in that direction. There's no doubt who's going to win in the elections this spring. It's going to be Vladimir Putin. But still, it's a very different form of autocracy now than it was then. There's still local elections. There's still rule of law. There's a lot of things that are not full-blown autocracy. Back to the 1991 ramifications of private ownership in land. There has been a privatization of land, which is really historic in the long run of Russian history, and that's a major break from the past. And in fact, Peter Stolypin, the prime minister in 1906 who privatized land in the countryside, has been one of the biggest heroes of the post-Soviet era. A former minister of finance wrote a 2-volume biography of Stolypin. And he regularly finishes in the top 2 or 3 in polls about who's the greatest leader in or the greatest figure in Russian history. Unfortunately, Stalin won the last poll. So things are going in a bad direction. But he won it really not because everyone loves everything about Stalin, because he has become 100% associated with the idea of victory in World War II. And that is the one thing that the Soviet Union can be proud of. Everyone in Russia can be proud of that victory. The rule of law and independent courts was something that was, it was a process that was begun in the 1870s and expanded very much in the 1905 era. In the 1990s, so the Soviet Union abolished these kind of courts, and the very principle of the rule of law is something that constrains the government. The law instead became a prescriptive element of the administration that it used to shape policies and to implement policies. There was no such thing really as an unpredictable court case in the Soviet Union. That changed enormously in the 1990s, and an entire new constitutional system was created. One of the most interesting classes I ever took was in 1992 at Harvard Law School. Sarah Reynolds, a professor there, was flying back and forth with the Constitutional Court in Russia and advising on what the new constitution should look like. And so she'd show up every week and we'd talk about, well, what should the Russian constitution look like? It was, a totally fascinating process. And unfortunately, constitutions are really, really difficult to just draw up and plop down in a country that has no tradition of constitutions. It's kind of depressing because, the reason our Constitution works so well is that we had hundreds of years of British common law experience going into it and jurisprudence, and we used that. And it's really depressing to see. And that's one thing that we talked about a lot was the need to create a code-based system because of the lack of deeply entrenched norms in society. Well, that code-based system is easily manipulated by the central powers, unfortunately, and that's what happened pretty quickly. And the rule of law has really suffered. If you're brought to court by the branch, the prosecutorial branch in Russia, the conviction rate is 96% in the last. So really, most of the decisions are made in the pre-trial sort of investigatory stage by the Procuracy, which is a branch of the government. And so in terms of criminal and political rule of law, it has really taken huge steps backwards in the last 15 years. But businessmen, including Western businessmen in Russia, are very happy with the commercial law code and its enforcement. In fact, some of my American friends who are in business say it's so much more efficient than the American system and so much cheaper because enforcement is immediate and it's a complicated thing. I mean, the rule of law is a complicated thing, and it's working in some spheres and obviously very much not working in others. There were legal limits on, this is, I guess, an associated point, legal limits on the state and police that developed from 1864 to 1917. Those were eliminated in the Soviet era, and the police really became an institution to protect the state from the populace, not to protect members of the populace from each other so much. And the KGB, now known as the FSB, is back, and it's doing all kinds of things that the KGB used to do, including messing around in other countries' elections. We're just the last in a whole string of those kind of interventions that began in the former Soviet states nearby, especially in Ukraine and Georgia. And then spread to Montenegro, where there was an attempted coup, actually, that was supported by Russia. And then supporting far-right parties in Europe, and then ultimately the events that I'm sure you're probably tired of reading and talking about. If you're not, I am. But I'm happy to talk about it. And finally, the nationalization of property. Just a word about that. This was obviously one of the most central elements of Marxist theory that was implemented by the Communist Revolution. And it's clearly a Marxist thing. I mean, it's front and center in all of Marx's writings, is that nationalized property run by the state can be directed in ways that are better for the populace as a whole than if you leave things to the druthers of industrialists. But there's also something particularly Russian about how this nationalization took place in 1917, and particularly in how renationalization of industry has taken place in the last 20 years. Because in Russia, going back 1,000 years, I have a course that where one of the essay questions on the final exam is explain 1,000 years of Russian history by using two words, oil and fur. And what I mean by that is that the initial before there was anything in Russia, for the first 600 years of its existence, it was a fur extracting network akin to the French fur extraction network in North America, but one that upon which the entire Russian political system was based. There wasn't much that was worth doing in Russia except extracting furs, and the furs were very valuable. So the princes developed a political system of giving out river confluences and tributary networks for fur extraction to their brothers. And if a brother was not loyal to the grand prince, he would that control, that temporary control over that extraction network would be taken away. Why am I talking about stuff like 600 years ago in fur extraction networks? Well, because the exact same system was applied later to the extraction of other things. Serfdom became a comparable thing. Nobles who served the Tsar were given control over the populations of certain regions, temporarily and based on their loyal service to the Tsar. And they could extract as much wealth from those people in those places as possible in return. But they didn't really own the land. They were only given it temporarily in return for loyal service. Very different from the way things developed in medieval Europe with castles and the powerful dukes who, and barons who could oppose the power of the king at will and had their own armies to do so. Russia's development was very different in that sense. So it kind of fits in 1,000 years of history that Vladimir Putin's entire system would be based on a loyal group of people who were given temporary control over the revenues from gas and oil streams around him. And he has established a kind of a new kind of system of elites where they have incredible wealth, but it's not secure wealth. And if, for example, someone like Mikhail Khodorkovsky was a very wealthy owner of a gas and oil company. When he got dabbled in politics and supported opponents of Vladimir Putin, he was imprisoned and his firm was given to a different, more loyal person. And so it's kind of gone back to that. And Vladimir Putin's system is very much based on the idea of creating a very loyal elite that depends entirely on him for their wealth. And in many senses, I think that this elite, which is fabulously wealthy, I mean, I put up charts of American inequality that has grown. Russia's inequality is the greatest in the entire world, I think, other than Saudi Arabia. And it's because of the fabulous wealth of this handful of loyal people around Putin. And they're so loyal because their entire fortune is wrapped up in the system as it exists. And they know darn well that if Putin is no longer the sun around which all of the planets revolve, they might lose it all. And so they are, in some sense, even more invested in keeping the system going than, and keeping Putin in place than even Putin himself. All right, so what is the tally in the end of the Russian Revolution? Well, first, let's do a body count. In October 1917 led directly to 8 million deaths in a brutal civil war that Vladimir Lenin invited and knew was coming and wanted. About 5 million people died in the process of collectivization in the 1930s. 865,000 people were shot in the Great Purges of 1938. About 2 to 5 million people died in the Gulag, and of the 27 million who died in World War II, a great number died needlessly due to the excessively harsh policies of Joseph Stalin. So the body count is high. The consequences for Russian politics are dire. It stopped liberal political and cultural and religious evolution that had been really underway and had been in the midst of a real revolutionary process from 1861 to 1917. It really stopped all those trends and it sort of froze them for 70 years. And I think Russia found that you can't just turn the engine back on after 70 years and have things run smoothly. And it hasn't run smoothly. Along with this, it destroyed a sophisticated and liberalizing Orthodox Church, and the church that has emerged is much less liberal than it might have otherwise been. So many of the best things about the revolution, and I went through that list, many of the best things have been reversed and many of the worst have come back. So given this sort of bleak record, it's no surprise that many Russians see the revolution as a disaster to be avoided at all costs. And many also see the 1991 collapse of communism and revolutionary transformation as a great disaster, something akin to our Great Depression. And this is something that Putin and his regime has used to their own advantage. 100 years later, the revolution really stands as a warning to the populace. One of the big conferences that I went to this fall was right before the centenary of the October Revolution. It was the Academy of Sciences and the leading diplomatic academy, and there were all kinds of famous people there. And there was a Duma deputy, a member of the parliament, who is a specialist in foreign affairs and has a degree in history. And she gave the keynote address, and she concluded quite simply. She said, well, so, the October Revolution, in a way, it paved the way for industrialization, I guess. So I guess that was okay, because industrialization was necessary to win World War II, which was definitely important and something that we celebrate. So maybe in a sense, the October Revolution can be kind of celebrated a little bit, but in the end, really, I think this is her speaking, I think what the October Revolution teaches us is that Russia should never, ever, ever have another revolution ever again. And I'm sure that was approved at the highest level, that message. In the end, I guess it's kind of a dark way to end, but I share the view of a Russian optimist. And you know what a Russian optimist thinks? He says, things are terrible, they could not be worse. They're just awful, awful. But I am a Russian optimist. It could definitely be much worse. And in that sense, I'd like to end on a more optimistic note, that the liberal optimist would say that the real revolutions in Russia, the real revolutions, I see the October Revolution as, in most ways, a reactionary moment of the restoration of autocracy and the reversal of what was the real revolution, which was the 1905 revolution, the most important revolution of 1917. The liberal revolutions. It's in one century, Russia has had three liberal revolutions: the 1905 revolution, the February 1917 revolution, and 1991. 1991 was many things. It was a state collapse in the same sense that I like to interpret 1917 as a state collapse. But it was also a real revolution. There's a great book on this by Leon Aron that really makes the case comprehensively. But I was in those crowds. My parents were with me there in Russia in the early 1990s. We went to a song festival in Estonia where there were 1 million Estonians singing their way to freedom in one spot. This is in a country that had 900,000 ethnic Estonians in it, so that's impressive. There was a 1 million person chain across the Baltic states that held hands to demonstrate for democracy. In Red Square, in the peak of the events in 1991, there were well over 1 million people, just as far as the eye could see, demonstrating. This summer, I went to St. Petersburg and went to Mars Field in St. Petersburg, which is a famous location for demonstrations during 1917. And the whole park was full, at least initially. There was a whole line of police trucks waiting, and they arrested about a third of the crowd. So I didn't stay too long. But one thing that was striking to me in looking around the crowd is that everyone was 20 years old or younger. And if you think that Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999, 2000, he's the only person these kids have ever known, the only form of government. And it's different, because one of the things that I think is a big, something that isn't quite understood in America is how deep the humiliation of the 1990s was for Russia. Russia had been a great global power, one of the superpowers, and it was reduced to utter total collapse. The unemployment rate was 50%. I had signed contracts with the famous professors at Moscow State University to bring students around, and here these famous professors were going around and giving tours to a bunch of American undergrads, and even while doing that, some of them had to work jobs selling cigarettes in kiosks to make it. These were deeply humiliating times for everyone. And one of the reasons Putin has lasted so long is that, he got lucky. He came into power exactly when oil prices started to go up. So there was an influx of revenue that allowed Russia to recover, and that recovery has given him a lot of support. But the hopeful thing for the future, I think, is that that generation that was humiliated and accepts everything under Putin's rule. They will pass. There's a new generation coming, and I saw them in the streets. They're not going to take it forever. So that's an optimistic thing. And this rich, I think, revolutionary tradition of 1905, 1917, and 1991 is something that Russia's czars, past and present, really have. It gives them something to worry about, because history is never over. And that's all I got to say. So we have plenty of time for some questions if you'd like.
Could you say something Okay. Could you say something about the antagonism between Trotsky and Stalin and the differences in their views of Soviet communism?
It's a huge topic, and if you Google anything about Russian Revolution, you will find many answers to this, because the most active posters on the internet are Trotskyites, and there are still Trotskyite circles in Britain. So there's lots to say about this. But I don't know. It's a tricky one, because when Stalin purged Trotsky out of the leadership in the late 1920s, he rounded up anyone associated, he and his police rounded up anyone associated with Trotsky, and Trotsky ended up in exile, and had many followers who thought, well, Trotsky would have done it differently than Stalin. He wouldn't have created so many victims and the like. But I don't know. I don't know if that's really true, because Trotsky's vision of industrialization also was based on collectivization. And that also would have been extremely brutal. And he proved pretty clearly in his actions as commander of the Red Army during the Civil War that he was willing to use extremely brutal methods to mobilize for the end goal of communism and for rapid industrialization. In fact, he was the author in the Civil War of a very brutal policy of gathering grain from the villages by sending armed detachments into the villages and just taking it by force. And then because all the workers were running away from the factories because they weren't being paid and the state didn't have any means to pay them, he introduced a policy called the militarization of labor, which basically took military units and sent them into the factories to produce things. And so a kinder, gentler Soviet Union under Trotsky is it's kind of hard to see that. Would it have been different? Probably, though. I mean, he had his different, personal quirks, and he was always, I think he's a little more interesting than Stalin, too, in terms of his ideology. And so, who knows? One thing he probably would have done, and one of the things that in the 1920s, Stalin and Trotsky's followers argued a lot about, was whether the communist revolution had to be a global international revolution to succeed. And Trotsky really believed that pretty consistently through the 1920s. So it probably would have put more effort in trying to spread the revolution abroad than Stalin did. Stalin enunciated the doctrine of Stalinism, of communism in one country, focusing the revolution only on first succeeding within the Soviet Union and then spreading the revolution and giving up on the idea of global revolution. And I don't think Trotsky would have done that. So there's a lot more things that one could say. But he, by the way, wrote, by many accounts, I think, one of the best histories of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. It's a really powerful narrative, really, really an interesting narrative of the revolution.
I was wondering, population and size of the Russia, the population and the area.
Yeah. Well, it's still the largest country in the world, but that's a little deceptive. It's about 100. I mean, it's really been like around 130 million for most of its the last 100 years or so, right in that range. Even with the great losses of 30 million people, it still grew in population through the 20th century. But its size is deceptive because such a big portion of the country is not. I mean, it makes Wisconsin look like the Bahamas. I mean, it's like most of it is just extremely cold, and you can't really do anything productive there unless you find oil and gas. And even if you find oil and gas, they have huge reserves in the far eastern Siberia, but they're just not. It's just not viable to get them out of the ground because it's too expensive to operate when your average winter temperature in some of these areas is about 50 below, 30 to 50 below. It just is not viable. But global warming, if you're an optimist, global warming will make it possible to drill all of this.
Now that the child prince has isolated the United States as a world power, Germany is looked to be the heir apparent for NATO, and Germany has just done, I believe, a sweetheart deal with Russia for oil and gas pipeline connecting. Is that what you were referring to with regards to the use of oil and fossil fuels as a way of Russia expanding its power? Because as I understand it, that makes it easier for Russia to reacquire the Ukraine now.
Well, it's a very complicated thing because in the Soviet era, one of the things that kept the Soviet Union together as long as it did was subsidized exports of oil and gas from Russia, from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe. And when Eastern Europe broke away in 1989, they faced a real crisis in the decline in cheap gas and oil available. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the same thing was true. And I think this is an instance where things have been, I think, exaggerated a little bit. For a while, I had a poster of a cover of The Economist. I love the covers of The Economist magazine. But they had one of Putin dressed like a gangster with a gas thing from a gas station, and using his power, the control of the pump. The problem is, and Russia has tried to use this power, but there are a couple I think mistaken notions in the West where we see this as having real impact. And one is that Russia continued to sell gas and oil well under global prices up until very, very recently, and used that, yes, as a lever to gain political influence in not just Ukraine, but Hungary and other places. But I mean, the threat was, we're going to raise your prices to global levels, which is kind of fair in a way, you know. We'll stop subsidizing your gas and oil. So there's that. And then the other thing is they tried in a couple instances, I know when the NATO discussions were underway for Hungary and Bulgaria and Romania, Russia briefly cut off gas supplies to these three countries to teach them a lesson. Well, then the gas piled up and caused all kinds of problems in the gas export system, and they had to find alternative outlets for it. It was very problematic. And it didn't have the desired effect. And so it's a threat that can't be used, basically, because they can't turn off the taps for extended periods of time. And when they do, it makes these countries think that, well, this supply is very unreliable. And that's been a big issue for Germany, is that they have now sought alternative sources. They've really pushed probably harder than they would have otherwise into renewables. If you go to Germany, you'll be amazed. Like every single square inch of Germany is covered with solar panels and wind farms. And second, they, like the United States, have gone big time into fracking and alternative sources that they themselves can produce. And they've also begun to import liquefied natural gas from other sources. So it's a weapon that you can't use. It's kind of like a nuclear option in a way. It looks impressive on paper, but it's not as powerful in the end. Yeah. It's really hard. You know, I studied Ukraine. My dissertation advisor was Roman Shporluk, who's Ukrainian, and my first dissertation topic was going to be about the history of Russian and Ukrainian relations. And it's a very tragic thing. I mean, the intervention in Crimea was one thing, I think, that's very separate and different from the intervention in the Donbass region. And the U.S. sanction regime has really put the two in kind of the same category, and I think inappropriately so. It's a very complex history, but Crimea was traditionally much more ethnically Russian and was actually part of the Russian Federation until 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev gave it to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic as a present, I guess, on the 300th birthday or 300th anniversary of the unification of Ukraine with Russia. And it's a big, complicated story because Ukraine itself is divided into different regions. The western regions are much more pro-EU association, much more interested in association with NATO and very anti-Russian, whereas the eastern regions are much more comfortable with Russian language and want close relations with Russia. And Russia really screwed up. I mean, when Putin, in a peak, just impetuously annexed Crimea, it unleashed private militias, both from Russia and domestically in the Donbass. And in the end, what he lost was the most pro-Russian voting districts of Ukraine, and assured that the nationalists, Ukrainian anti-Russian bloc would win every election going forward, because the best voting areas were now outside of the voting areas of Ukraine. And so it's been a real disaster for Russia as well as Ukraine. And at enormous human cost too. I mean, it's a hot war that's still going on. There's still shooting there, and over 5,000 people have died, and it's had enormous economic implications. But I'm a Russian optimist. It could be worse. No, I don't know. I don't know what the future will hold. Actually, the model for the future is already there. There are several regions in the post-Soviet space where de facto situations of non-statehood have been recognized and have been, in some instances, policed by the United Nations and recognized as such. They're called frozen conflicts. They exist on the borderline of Moldova with Ukraine. There's a region called Transnistria, which is kind of an independent state de facto. There's in the country of Georgia in the south, there are two regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that are really, I mean, Russia's recognized them as independent, but nobody else in the world has, but they are de facto independent now. States very reliant on Russia. And so there are examples in the post-Soviet space of what the Donbass may look like 20 years from now. It's hard to imagine a negotiated withdrawal, given all of the nationalistic sort of rhetoric that's been poured out about, and all the, ooh, we're great, you know, Russia, we're back and we're strong. It's hard to imagine someone like Vladimir Putin withdrawing after all that's been said, and how much Russian national patriotic thought and feeling has been invested in this region. So it's a very sad situation.
You caught my attention when you mentioned that Stalin advocated dependence on domestic resources only, and I believe no foreign dependence. And you returned to that, but I wonder if you could expand a little on the consequences of such policies and whether you see any similarities to current isolationist tendencies in America.
So if you look at the history of industrializations in the 19th century, Britain was first, and it took a long time, and they relied pretty heavily on domestic resources, but their industrialization also built on sort of a base that was developed through the agrarian revolution, building up a much more productive agrarian base, and then they used that, and they gradually invested, and it wasn't something that occurred overnight. Every other industrialization after that relied on a huge influx of investment from abroad and loans, everyone. And in most cases, it was at least 50% of all new gross domestic investment drove industrialization processes. And Russia had launched its industrialization in the 1890s. And half of all of the new gross domestic capital formation came from abroad, either in loans or in direct investment, half. And even more importantly, a lot of the most advanced technology, and actually physically engineers and managers and people who knew how to run a great latest high-tech smelter came to Russia and actually opened up factories. My favorite is in this region that has been in the center of the fighting in the Donbass. John Hughes from Scotland came and opened up a coal and smelting operation down there and created an entire base, which is now known as Yuzovka, named after Hughes. But anyway, that's how you industrialized. That was the pattern for the world. And so when the Soviet Union launched an industrialization with almost no direct foreign loans or investment, it was unprecedented. Now, there was a question earlier whether Trotsky would have done it differently. I don't know if anyone could have done it differently, because one of the first things the Bolsheviks did was say that we're not going to pay back any of the loans that we've taken during World War I, and they also declared the nationalization of all industry, both domestic and foreign. So going back to foreigners and asking them to invest in Russia, which actually, ironically enough, Trotsky did in the 1920s, met with kind of a shrug. You just nationalized all our properties and now you want to invest in the Soviet. So it really wasn't an option after the events of the early events of nationalization during and abrogation of loans in the initial stages of the Bolshevik Revolution.
What is your reaction to this recent hysteria over Russia? Do you think it's justified, or do you think that there's a better way to be handling this?
So I've spent basically now 25 years as an advocate for better U.S. Russian relations, and I've done a lot of things on that score. One of the things I did was we created at American University an initiative for Russian culture, and we've been doing big performances with Russian performers at the Russian embassy, and I mean, I've put a lot into better U.S. Russian relations, and I mean, right now, for the first time in my life, I kind of want worse U.S. Russian relations, in a sense. I mean, within reason, of course. I mean, they're a nuclear power, and one should always negotiate. The best powers to negotiate with are your enemies, because you really should negotiate with your enemies. And if your friends you don't need, it's not that important as important with friends. So any power, we should negotiate with Iran, we should negotiate with Russia. But to look the other way after what Russia did in our elections, to look the other way after what Russia did in Ukraine is, I think not the path to go on. So, I mean, I think there has to be firm response on these things personally. So for me to say that is very painful because I've invested a lot in better U.S. Russian relations and engagement with each other. So that's where we're at. What's that?
Wait 1 second. Let's get the microphone. And this is going to be our last question before we break. And
Could you comment on Trump's relationship with Putin?
We had a whole hour without any Trump. It was so glorious. I spend so much effort trying to avoid mentioning that the name that shall not be named, and it's hard. So, you know, I actually don't know all that much more than any of you, except that. You know, there was an extensive effort to buy up Facebook ads, and a lot of people saw them. There's actually a really interesting article in the Washington Post today by a friend of mine, Lucan Wei, who did a really in-depth study of whether Russian intervention actually affected the outcomes, because Russia has now intervened in, he counts 11 major interventions in foreign elections. We're number 11. And his conclusion is that really it probably didn't affect the outcome in any event. And I don't know, I haven't looked into it in the same kind of depth as he has, but he's a really serious guy. And that's kind of the opposite of what he wants to believe. So I respect that. But still, I mean, it's intervening in other people's elections. It's not a good thing. And there should be, I think, going back to that previous question, I think there should be diplomatic consequences for that. I mean, if they're going to mess around in our elections, we should, you know, stand up and say no, that's not appropriate. Just saying there's no collusion that's not an answer.
so if we could give a round of applause to Eric Lohr. Thank you.
Thank you.